Just for the purposes of this, just start with your name.
My name?
Yes.
My name is Jose Manin. Remember that guy? My name is Dick Irvin. Irvin.
When did you get started in the business?
Well, I don't know, David, if I could say it. I got started when I was 8 years old.
Oh, doing good.
Well, my father was a hockey coach, Dick Irvin Sr., and he coached in the NHL for 26 years, and he just finished coaching Toronto for 9 years, and he moved from Toronto to Montreal to coach the Montreal Canadiens. Our home was in Regina, and once I started school in kindergarten, he didn't move the family. We stayed in Regina for the winter, and he came down. Seasons were a lot shorter, 48 games, not 82 like they are now. So we came down for Christmas time, the first year that he was here. I was 8 years old. My sister was 4, and he lived in a hotel when he was coaching. And there was a fellow named Cliff Butler had a sportscasting show on the radio, and he would do it from the Forum in the evening. Didn't matter what was going on, a hockey game or a hockey practice or whatever. He did this show from the Forum, and my dad went down to be on with him, and he took me with him. And during the course of the live interview with my father, he put me on the air. He asked me a couple of questions. And he asked me more than a couple of questions. And I talked and made a little voice, even squeaker than I have during my career. And that was on a record somewhere. In our family for years. I don't know where it is now, but there I was, 8 years old, talking on the radio. So I figure that was the first time that I was ever on broadcasting. But what used to happen, my mother always built me a rink in the backyard in Regina. And Saturday night, we would get Foster Hewitt and Hockey Night in Canada radio version, and we never got the Canadiens games. That's what used to bother me. My dad's team, we never heard his team on the radio. It was always the Maple Leafs because he was coaching Montreal. I would get nervous when they talk about the out-of-town scores to see how they did. And the next morning, on Sunday mornings, I would go to this rink all by myself, and I would skate around, and at the top of my squeaky little voice, broadcast the game I'd heard the night before. And I would use the same names with the same players, if the Leafs were playing the Rangers or the Red Wings or whatever, I would have those names on. We had a crabby neighbor lady, Mrs. Calder, and she used to phone my mother and complain that I was making too much noise in the back rink. And when it finally ended up that I was doing that for a living, my mother got such a kick out of it. The fact that she remembered me in the backyard broadcasting a game. That's right, exactly. Shoots, he scores. And so that's how I got started. I always was fascinated by the radio business, though. My dad would come home to Regina as a bit of a celebrity when the season would be over, and they'd always have him go up to the local radio station, CKCK, and do an interview with the sportscaster when he would get home and talk about the season and the Stanley Cup or whatever. And they got to a point, I guess, I got old enough that he would bring me with him. And I remember being fascinated by everything that had to do with the station, and the announcing, and as a kid. But I never pursued it. I never followed up. I never got a summer job at a radio station or anything like that. And I remember once when I was working for the Shell Oil Company in the early 50s, after I got through at McGill, we had moved to Montreal when I was 19 years old, calling Al Colley, who was a sportscaster at CJD in Montreal, and saying to him, Al, what would be the chances of me getting into the broadcasting business? And he explained that to start off, you would go to a small town, and you'd do everything. You'd sweep the floor, you'd play the records, you'd read the news, and start, and then you might get a break, and a couple of years later come to a bigger town, and finally you might get to a city like Regina, and then the big goal would be to get to Toronto or Montreal. Mm-hmm. It seemed to me, my life was pretty good in those days. It seemed to me, that's too much of a pain to do all that and not make very much money, so I passed on it, But I always had the interest. I always had the fascination. And I grew up listening to radio, and I listen to the old shows on the satellite radio even today.
So what was you bypassed the long route in, so how did you actually get your first gig?
I started in broadcasting 8 years after I got through at McGill. I had worked as an accountant pretty well all through that. But the new television station in Montreal opened up in January of 1961, CFCF Television, the CTV network. We had the CBC, of course, and since 1952. And so they opened up the station, and it was quite a hit. It was a big hit. And the sports department was run by a fellow named Brian McFarlane. But he was the only one. They hired one sportscaster, and he had to do everything. They hired freelancers to do the weekends, possibly. And he was swamped. He was doing early news, late news, whatever. He needed help. And the second or third week that the station was on the air, he had me, it was minor hockey week in Canada, and I was coaching hockey with kids. And he had me come up. He had heard me on, no, he hadn't heard me on the radio yet. He had me come up to the station. He met me at a hockey game. He'd come to the games, and I was the official scorer at the Montreal games. My father had passed away 4 years before that. And he said to me one time, we're going to do this show about minor hockey. He said, would you like to come up with a minor hockey player that you coach and talk about minor hockey week? And they had a show called Sportsman's Club, live Sunday afternoons, 2:00. And he said, while you're at it, I said, I'm going to talk about your dad. I said, well, I've got a scrapbook at home that goes back to 1910. He said, bring the book with you, and we'll talk about your dad. So up I go. And the funny thing was, there was a live show called Forum, which was an intellectual think tank type program that was on just before ours. And on that particular show was René Levesque, who was there as a guest. And the host was a fellow I used to play hockey with at McGill called Graham Teasdale. Anyway, they would just move the camera 1:30 to 2, and then they'd switch the cameras from one end of the room to the other, and bingo, the next show was on live. That's the way it was, you know. And somewhat like now, Brian couldn't shut me up once we got going about my dad and so on, and it went well. And anyway, then I was on the radio one night between periods at a hockey game in Montreal. I was there as official scorer, and they used to have these hot stove league things between periods, and they put me on one night to talk about different things. And Brian happened to hear that show, so the next time we ran into each other at a hockey game, he said, "Do you ever think of going into broadcasting?" And I kind of played, well, you know, I don't know. He said, well, would you like to come up and take an audition? And so I said, well, okay. In the meantime, I went out and bought a typewriter, and I typed scripts, and I sat at home with a tape recorder that I also bought and talked into it and read my scripts like sports guy, getting ready for my big audition. And he called me and said, you know, we've been thinking, and we really need someone with experience, so you know, if I can do anything about getting you a job somewhere else, maybe, you want to be sure and let me know. That was it, finished. But it really bugged me. You know, I had the bug. And so one day at lunch hour at my work, I called Doug Smith. Now, Doug Smith was the broadcaster who preceded Danny Gallivan in Montreal as the broadcaster for the Canadians. He did their games for about 10 or 11 years, starting in the early 40s. And my father helped get him the job. Doug was from Calgary. And he wrote to my dad in Regina in the summertime, or maybe phoned him. I don't know, said, I hear the job is open at Montreal for the English language play-by-play man with the Canadians, which it was, whoever had been doing it, retired or whatever. And Dad, without even knowing Doug Smith, put in a good word for him in Montreal, and anyway, he got the job, and he had the job. But Doug had branched out on his other things, and he'd left the hockey broadcasting. So I thought, I wonder if he could help me get a job. So I went up to his place. He happened to be in his office. I went up at my lunch hour at work, and I told him what had happened with Brian and CFCF. He said, you're just the guy he wants. He said, he's struggling here, doesn't know the territory, doesn't know the people. He said, leave it with me. That night I got home from work around 5 o'clock, and the phone is ringing, and it was Brian. We've had a bit of a change of mind here, and he didn't let on. He never mentioned Doug Smith's name. So 3 or 4 days later, up I go to CFCF and had an audition, read my own sportscast that I had written out longhand, actually. I don't think I did the typewriter. And then I interviewed him. He said, then that was the deal. I was going to read a sportscast for 3 or 4 minutes and then interview Brian. I'd never done an interview in my life. And so I interviewed him. Don't ask me what I did. And when it was over, he said, you're just the guy I want. He said that to me, just in private. Anyway, that was on about a Tuesday or a Wednesday, and they called me the next day and offered me the job. $75 a week. That's all they would pay. That's why they didn't have anybody with experience. Right. Nobody would take the job. Married guys, were they going to move from the West? They had lots of applications. Right. But when they came around to telling them how much money it was going to be, they said, no, I'm going to take that job. So I was still single, living at home with my mother, and as I say, it's the only adventuresome thing I ever did in my life. And so the fellow I was working for at the time, he was wonderful. He said, fine, go, anything I can do, And I started the following Monday, May the 8th, 1961, my first day of broadcasting. And I remember that we went out to lunch that day with the two ladies, Babs Pitt and Pat Marini, who were the PR directors for the station. They wanted to write a publicity release about this new guy that was going to be doing sports on the television. And they could not believe that I had never even ever talked on the air, more or less, you know. I was totally without experience. They thought that was really something. They couldn't believe that. And they told me that I would be around the station for about, they said 6 to 8 weeks. You'll just observe, you know, and then we'll put you on the air. 8 days later, I did my first sportscast. And I was on the air from then on for that station for almost exactly 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Who owned that station back then?
Marconi, Canadian Marconi owned it.
Right.
And they had to give it up. They had built it, and they had CFCF radio, which was a well-established. CFCF, Canada's first, Canada's finest. It was the first radio station. They claim in the world, like KDK Pittsburgh always used to take credit of being the first radio station. But I think statistics show CFCF beat them onto the air in Canada. And so that was how they got the CFCF, and they owned that station at that time. I don't know who owned it first, maybe it was Marconi, I don't know. But then they put in a rule that you could not, ownership of broadcasting in Canada had to be more than 50% Canadian. And Canadian Marconi was owned 51% by English Electric from England. So they had to give up the radio and TV station. By then we're in the same building and like a combined operation. And so they had to give it up, and they had a series of owners after that. But the Brofman family actually owned it for a while, and so when I was working there. And when I finally left the station in 1991, 30 years later, it was owned by Mr. Pouliot, Jean Pouliot.
Can you paint a bit of a picture for us of Montreal back in those early days of your career? I mean, it was a great, still is, but really a great city back then. A lot of action, and it was the biggest city in Canada.
Yeah.
It had the greatest sports team for sure. And I'm a Maple Leaf fan. It must have been a pretty exciting place.
Well, I guess it was. I'd been an accountant. As I say, I was single, lived with my mother. It was a great spot. And it really, the TV station really made an impact on the city. It was fresh, it was new, they had a bunch of guys like me who really didn't have that much experience, and people appreciated that, I think, you know? Here's this new station, and we did things that the CBC, and bless the CBC, I have worked with the CBC for a long time, but they weren't doing the kind of shows that we ended up doing. Jimmy Tapp hosted a show called Carte Blanche, 6 o'clock at night. Jimmy was a legend in Montreal broadcasting, both on radio and at the CBC television. And they did shows like that. They did a light young show with kids dancing with special guests. Heck, Jerry Lewis was up one day to the studio and appeared on Light Young. It kind of, like Montreal was a vibrant city, and the station caught on to that and tried to do things that matched the city, you know, and live half-hour sports shows. CBC never had that stuff, never, you know, and that's why I think the station became so successful. It was great to be part of it at the beginning, because none of us knew what we were doing. And that was obvious to the viewers, but they loved it.
Well, 67 must have been special.
Yes, it was. I get back just to the beginning there. I can say none of us knew what we were doing. They had a lot of professional broadcasters that they had hired. Right. Dean Kay, Art Leonard, Brian McFarland. These guys were very experienced broadcasters, you know, and brought in from other places. But then they augmented the on-air talent with people like me who had no experience at all, would work for next to nothing. and I remember all my buddies thought when they saw me on the late news or the early news or whatever, boy, you're on television, you must be making a lot of money. You know? I didn't have the heart to tell them that I was 8 years out of college and I'd gone to work for $75 a week. And they told me I was going to be on probation for 3 months. And 3 months, August 8th came, and I drove into work. And I kept saying, that's going to be it. They're going to say, thanks a lot, but no thanks. You know, and I went to work that day, and nobody said a word. Next day, nobody said a word. Nobody said anything. Then I got my next paycheck. I was up to $82.50. I said, I must have made it.
Right.
So when I retired, and they had a little dinner for me, I said, you know, I'm still on probation. I worked for 30 years at this place, and I was always on probation. You know, that's what I thought. But yeah, 67 was, you know, 67, well, in the late 60s, I think of two things especially, Expo 67 and the beginning of the Expos, which was 2 years later, in 69. Mm-hmm. That was a very exciting time, that whole era. The Canadians had good hockey teams. They won the Stanley Cup in 65 and 64 and 65 and 66, and And the Leafs won in '67, remember that? And then back to Montreal in '68 and '69. Bobby Orr came to play for the Boston Bruins, so they won it in '70. That was all part of our scene with the Canadians. Only 6 teams in the NHL. When I first started, 6 teams in black and white. That's what they say about Toronto. Last time the Leafs won the Cup, they were in black and white. Next time they win it, they'll be in color. And so, it was the one thing that kind of, when you had the job that I had, that kind of, I wouldn't say held you back, but it kind of cut you out. You're doing the late news. That was, and I did it for many years. And you get out of the office at midnight. Right. I couldn't stay for the whole hockey games. I couldn't, be out and about the town in the evening because you were working. Guys used to tell me, I called you in your office 9 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock. You weren't there. I said, why don't you call at midnight? Mm-hmm. I'm still working at midnight. Somebody has to be there. Saturdays, Sundays. It was we weren't exactly overstaffed, and you had to spend an awful lot of time working and. And we did a lot of specialty shows in those days too. But Expo '67 for me, my main sports memory was CTV got the rights to do all this. They had a lot of sporting events in Expo '67. They had a soccer tournament, and England had won the World Cup in '66. England was there. The same players were there playing at the Autostat, playing Russia and Mexico and all these other places. Nobody went to the games until the final. It was between England and I forget who they played. It might have been Russia. Anyway, England won. The tennis but they had rowing, they had track and field, all the great track and field performers from all over the world came. They really put on, and I did sports I did pretty well everything. I did sports I'd never done before, never canoeing, lacrosse, and we carried it all. So I was down at Expo a lot, but from the standpoint of doing the sporting events that were going on. And Johnny Esau, who ran CTV, was very good to me in those days, and always was good to me. And we did in fact, that same year, 1967, in the spring, I went over to my first trip to Europe. I went with Johnny to Austria to do the World Hockey Championships. In those days, just to show you, we would do a game like today, right? Wouldn't be seen here. It was on tape. They put the tape on an airplane, fly it over, and they'd run it the next day. Yeah. The only game we were going to do live was if Canada made the finals. Then we were going to do that live, but Canada got eliminated in the semifinals by Russia on an offside goal. And and so we never did anything live. And so you heard the score tonight on the news, and you saw the game tomorrow. Right. That's how we did it.
So you mentioned the Expos in '69.
Yeah.
Did you do much with the team?
No, not. I was when they first came on, first arrived. The radio was done by a station called CKGM. CFCF got the rights a couple of years later, but I was never involved. The Expos had their own. Basically, Dave Van Horn, Duke Snyder. They paid the broadcasters. That was the difference. I was never paid a dime by the Montreal Canadiens. Or any of the broadcasters in Canada doing the Maple Leafs or the Vancouver Canucks. We always worked for a station or a production house or whatever. But in the States, the teams hire the broadcasters. That's why there's so much. That's why they say we and us. If I'd have said that here in Montreal, if I'd have said, well, we're leading 2-1 or we're not playing very good, they would have run me out of town. Yeah. It's a different mindset in Canada, especially here in Montreal. Mm-hmm. And but the baseball guys could do it. Right. Baseball guys could do it and get away with it. But if we ever slipped, we'd hear about it from people. They didn't like that.
Yeah. Did you, when you started announcing hockey in the hockey games, did you feel the ghost of Foster Hewitt with you?
No, because Danny Gallivan was too well established in Montreal, and Foster had retired. Now, when I joined Hockey Night in Canada, which was a bit of a fluke because I worked for a CTV station, but Hockey Night I was on CBC. But the fellow who ran CFCF at the time, Bud Hayward, he desperately wanted to get me on that show because he said he thought it would be good for his station to have their guy on the premier sports show on CBC, and that's the way it worked out. Yeah. CTV carried hockey on Wednesday nights, and it was produced by the same company. But and it was all the same crew. Danny did the games. The only difference was Dan Kelly, who was a full-time CBC employee in Ottawa, was doing Danny's color. CBC wouldn't let him go on CTV on Wednesday nights. So that's how I fell into that job. Right. And I didn't work Saturday nights because Dan would be back doing the games on Saturday. And then he left and went to St. Louis and one thing and another, and I ended up on Hockey Night in Canada. But no, Foster was on the shows when I started. He would come on like the Eminence Grise, and he would pick the 3 stars at the end of the game and so on and so forth. He knew my father very well. My dad, he was doing the games. The early days of Foster Hewitt was when my dad coached in Toronto for 9 years. He knew my mother very well. He had a long talk with my mother one night after a hockey game in Montreal that he happened to be at and she was at, and I got the two of them together. But as far as I know, Foster Hewitt never knew my name. He only called me Kid. Hi, Kid. He never called me Dick once, ever. Even on the air when we would I did a couple of interviews. I was nervous because Foster was Foster, and but by then he had left the booth and he was doing it now. Right. And then he came back to do the 72 series, but I wasn't involved in that.
Now, if you were to say there were mentors for you, who would be top of the list?
Brian McFarland. He was Danny, of course, but I've been in the business. Brian only stayed a year at CFCF, and then he went back to Toronto. But in that year, he brought me into the world of television, the world of newscasts, sportscasts, and Brian had a great approach to sportscasting. He used to be funny. He used to try to do offbeat stuff, and I fell into that mode, and I think I kind of carried on for a good part of when I would do things. Okay, you got to get the scores 3-2 or 4-1 or whatever, but entertain the people. The people out there, I always felt with those late night shows that I did, they had a choice. They could sit there and watch us do the news and the sports, or they could switch to a movie. You had to make it interesting for them to watch. You had to let them think that there might be something different on tonight. This guy might be a little kooky and so on. And I think that's one of the things that CFCF did very well.
Do you think that you've been able to mentor other people along this?
Well, I did. I had a lot of people come to work for me over the years, as the years went on, and I became, right up to the end of my time at CFCF, 30 years of it, I was involved both with radio and television. And there would be radio would hire young sportscasters. Television, I hired people in my day. I became the sports director as soon as Brian left, and I had that job for the last 29 years I worked there. And I hired a lot of names, of people that, one fellow, Randy Tiemann, is still there, still working at the station now. There's no more radio station, CFCF, but there's television. So I hope I helped them. To me, the sportscasts today don't look much different than they did in my day, but it was nice. And another, in the mentoring end of it, on Hockey Night in Canada, they started to use 3 men in the booth, and they would use former players. And they needed help. They needed help. I worked with Scotty Bowman. When Scotty, shows you how smart hockey people are, Scotty Bowman, the greatest coaching record in the history of the game, he went for a few years, and that'd be in the 90s, without work. Nobody hired him. And so he worked at Hockey Night in Canada. And Scotty asked me, I was quite flattered. I learned a lot about hockey from Scotty Bowman.
Okay.
I traveled with the team. See, we started with the radio in 1969 at CFCF. So I traveled with the Montreal Canadiens for 33 years. And everywhere they went, I went. And Scotty was a coach for 8 years during that stretch. It was like going to school with him. I didn't try to make a bug of myself, and I'm not an analyst, and I couldn't get that job today on Hockey Night in Canada. Maybe on radio, but not because you have to be a former player or a former coach. They wouldn't hire a guy like me to do. But so I was a color man. I wasn't an analyst, but I did my best that I could with the game and how the game was played. And of course, amazing how many things my dad told me came back to help me out in the pinch. And Scotty was a great help when he was the coach, even just listening to him, without even asking him questions. And you end up finding yourself or the game in a situation where you could sound like you knew what you were talking about, but it was just something that my dad had told me or Scotty had told me, So that's not what you had to do. That's what I couldn't say I played in the NHL like these fellows do today. And more power to them. Some of them, I went through a lot of them. Some of them are very good and made quite a career out of it. Mickey Redmond was a player who started, first Detroit Red Wing player to score 50 goals. It wasn't Gordie Howe, it was Mickey Redmond. Howe never got 50. Rocket did, though. I'm getting biased here. And Mickey started out with us here in Montreal on Hockey Night in Canada. Raw rookie from the word go, but he's still doing the games in Detroit, and that's many, many years. He just got elected to the media section of Hockey Hall of Fame a couple of years ago. Guys like him came along, and I worked with them very closely, and I hope I helped.
Talk about, what does that mean? I mean, I know what it means. Some people might not color man. What does that mean?
Well, you have to, like I used to say, my job started when the play stopped. And I started really doing color on television before I ever did it on radio. Radio, I was mainly play-by-play for the station. But you just, like, there's color to, you go to a Broadway show, it's colorful, there's color, there's, it's a show.
Right.
Hockey's a show.
Right.
It's, people pay money to go to see it. So you have to transmit to the viewer or the listener at home what's happening around the game itself, And on television, of course, they take a picture of bingo. There's Guy Lafleur, bingo. There's Brad Park, bingo. There's Rod Gilbert. You got to have things ready to say about these. I was always, and the way that they wanted it done was if somebody's picture was on the screen, that's who you talk about.
Right.
They don't do that so much now, in the picture, but it doesn't help me because I don't know the players anyway. There's too many teams. But in those days, you knew them all, but that was, it was just to the background. It was the atmosphere, the stories that might have happened, at practice in the morning or whatever. It was just all the things that went around. Now, then the instant replay came in. When I started on Hockey Night in Canada, and the show had been on the air since 1952. And I started my first year, I guess, was 66, 67, when I did that Wednesday night color. And then my first year of doing full-time color was 68, 69. I was kind of working on a lot of different things in that. But they used to have a rule that they'd only show maybe 2 or 3 replays a period. The feeling was too many replays. Now they show a goal. Every goal gets showed 5 times.
Oh, I know. It's annoying.
Too much.
It's annoying.
I don't like the editorial, but it's too much. But that's the way it was. So the rules were a lot different in those days. When I would go on the road in the playoffs, and that's the only time really we would do a road game, I didn't have a replay. The replays weren't shown on our monitor. They would be telling me back in Toronto what was on the screen. Okay, so Esposito's got the puck now, and he's down the right. So here's Esposito down the right side, and for this shot, I never saw it. That's what we used to call them, blind replays. Mm-hmm. That's how primitive it was, even in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And the show had been on the air for all those years. It was amazing.
It's like that Kevin Costner baseball film where the guy's got the hammer and he's doing the sound of the bat because he's listening to it on a feed in his ear.
Yeah, yeah.
You're a storyteller then. I mean, that's what you did.
That's
you
right.
told stories.
That's right. Danny Gallivan, the basic format with Danny was you didn't talk while he talked. I mean, he did the play. Now, if you notice, they come in and sometimes I think over-talk a little, the color analyst, whatever. So Danny did the play, and then he would stop. He wasn't too interested in what else was going on. That was my job.
Right.
So if they took a close-up of the visiting team's goalie, that was my job, to tell you a little bit about him. Right. Oh, he came from Melfort, Saskatchewan. He played his junior hockey in Moose Jaw or whatever, That's what I had to know, all that stuff.
You did a lot of research.
Yeah. And today, I didn't have computers.
Yeah.
Today, the stats that they can give are instantaneous, because they're all sitting there with computers.
Right.
The National Hockey League used to put out their statistics once a week.
Right.
It would be delivered to my office on Mondays. And you wouldn't hear from them again. Like you would, anything that happened, some guy might have had 10 goals that day, but maybe got 3 or 4 more during the week. You had to keep that all yourself.
Right.
Because they didn't, the teams never supplied you with anything. And Hockey Night in Canada didn't supply you with anybody.
You were constantly reading the wires.
Yeah, oh yeah, and at my office, but when you got to the forum, there were no wires to read, to do a hockey game. And there could be a trade that happened at 6:30 at night between Boston and Rangers, and you didn't know about it unless somebody happened.
Did you have a fairly detailed series of sources that you would phone, or?
I didn't do that much of that. So a lot of people do. I didn't. My sources was mainly the actual facts, the books, the yearbooks, the whatever. A great help would be each team puts out what they call their yearbook, just each team. So those are like gold for guys like me who would show up in Minnesota or somewhere and you don't know anything about it. But they'd have their yearbook, so you could track the background of the players and the background of the team and the history of it and so on. That's how it worked in those days.
Earlier, you were telling Carrie about Monument National. I went to l'École Nationale de Théâtre, So I played Hamlet on that stage, and you said that you had your studios in there?
No,
It was the Laurier.
No,
Oh, the
Laurier.
Sorry.
Laurier Theater.
Laurier.
It was a movie theater.
A movie theater. So what was this for CFCF?
Yeah, CFCF. The building was being built.
Right.
The Marconi had purchased this land up in Park Extension, Ferry, Montreal. Right, as it turned out, right across the railway tracks from where the Expos played at Jerry Park. Yeah, and so that's where they started. Only very temporary, very primitive. When I did my audition, I walked across planks in the lobby because the cement was wet. So I got in on the ground floor.
And you had dance studio next door?
It was a disco. On Saturday nights, you could hear it coming through the walls, and the guys reading the news, and you could hear. But funny, I never did a show from there, other than a couple of specialty shows, interview shows. I never read the news. The first time I read the news was the first week that they had opened up the station at the station for real. That was the first time I did a show called Newsroom 12, my first sportscast.
Now, you're an actor, remember?
Yes.
How did you become an actor, member?
By joining Hockey Night in Canada.
Right. And
When
you're
I
a broadcast journalist in those days.
Yeah. When I started at CFCF, there was no union. That's why I was only making $75 a week. And I would think it would be later in that first year, sometime during my first year at the station, the actor people, Victor Knight and others, came around and they talked to us. But nothing was signed, sealed, or delivered at all. It was a process of getting, and of course the station fought it, the management fought it. But by the time actor came and became the union for CFCF, my employer, I was part of management. Brian had left, gone back to Toronto. I was a sports director, so I didn't count. I didn't come in we had a couple of walkouts. I had to go in morning, noon, and night, do everything because I was management, whereas the announcers had walked out. So it was only, and quite frankly, I didn't join the union. There was no reason for me to join the union. It didn't do me any good anyway, and because I was a manager. I wasn't, but then when I joined Hockey Night in Canada, I had to join the union. Hockey Night, the CBC, in my 33 years at Hockey Night in Canada, I only worked for the CBC 1 year. The last year I was on the show, they took over the production of the program.
Right.
And therefore, then I got paid by the CBC. The previous 32 years, I had worked for a variety of production companies. McLaren Advertising ran it. They called it Canadian Sports Network. They called it Molestar Productions. I can't remember all the names it was. But they were totally separate from the CBC, and the CBC basically just turned a switch.
Right.
And there was the hockey game, because it was produced by other people, CBC personnel doing the cameras and so on, but it was a combined thing. But the producers were the ones who paid me. And in order to work on the show, I had to join actor. And thank goodness for the the Actor Fraternal Benefit Society, and it's been wonderful.
Why do you say that?
Because my medical bills, for one thing. That's good enough for me.
Yeah.
Insurance. And whatever I put away, the Hockey Night used to have to match it, I think it was, or I've never been too good at things like that, as the people at Actor can tell you. But it's been a wonderful security blanket.
That's fantastic.
For a guy like me. And you get married, you raise kids, and it's all part and parcel of the way you make a living.
Of all the sports broadcasts and events that you've been part of over the years, is there one or two that really jump out or special to you?
Yes. Like people ask me, who's the best player you ever saw? We're talking, they think of me as hockey. I did a lot besides hockey. I did football for 8 years on the radio, the Alouette football games. I've done 3 Olympic Games for CTV. I was very lucky. I was right place, right time. I was very lucky. But everybody connects me basically with hockey. I always used to say that I don't have the best player because there's too many good ones. I can't. I've seen every first team All-Star since 1938. Okay, which is the year I saw my first NHL game when I was 6 years old. My dad was coaching Toronto. But the 1971 was a year that I'll always remember. It was the year the Canadians weren't supposed to win the Stanley Cup, and they did. John Belival's last year, Ken Dryden's first year, Frank Mahovlich playing for the Canadians. They made a trade for him. Best trade the team ever made, as far as I'm concerned. So that was a year that, and they went right to the 7th game in Chicago. May 18th, 1971. John Belival skated off the ice with the Stanley Cup, and that was his last act as a member of the Montreal Canadiens. That's just a year that, like Canadians, the Boston Bruins had finished 24 points ahead of Montreal in the regular season. And I think the Canadiens had played in Boston the last game of the season, which didn't mean anything, and the Bruins had beaten them something like 7-1 or something. And that was the year Esposito scored 76 goals in 76 games. Unheard of, till 99 came along a little while after that. And so that was a year that really stood out for me because so many things happened. So many things happened that weren't supposed to happen, and I was part of the whole scene. You know, it was really good. But I tell people today, as I look back, you know, when you retire, you have to reminisce. You know, people want to know. The two highlights of my career was, number one, 17 years in the broadcast booth beside Danny Gallivan. Now, young broadcasters in that era would have given their right arm to do 17 games with Danny Gallivan.
The best.
And I did 17 years.
The best.
Maritimer. You know,
The best. It's the best.
Yeah.
The game came alive.
He really was, yeah. He really, you know. And the key about Danny, and it's something that I tried to remember for the rest of my career after I joined him, and my first year, and I'd only been in the business for 4 or 5 years before I got to sit beside Danny, was he treated me like I'd been there all through the whole piece. I wasn't a new kid on the block. I was just, there I was, the game was on, we're working together, you know, and I tried to do that, especially with the hockey players and the younger broadcasters who came along and sat in the booth or in the studio beside me. I tried to do the same. You know, it was really a lesson to. He also taught me how to prepare for a game. Danny used to have his, what we call it, we used to laugh, Danny's shirt boards. And he'd get his shirts back from the laundry, and I was coming, the board would be, and he would make his notes, and he'd bring his shirt boards. You know what? I used the shirt boards for years. Yeah, and when I'd go take I always took my shirts to the laundry just on purpose and have them.
So you got shirt boards.
So I have the boards to take, right? And I'd have a board for the Toronto Maple Leafs and a board for the Detroit Red Wings, and I'd keep my stuff up to date on each team and all my different boards. And the other highlight of my career, if you want to look for an instance, was when I was the co-MC of the night they closed the Forum. That was
emotional.
So emotional.
I can't imagine.
Yeah. And there I was, you know. That's the night they gave Rocket the ovation they gave the Rocket. I've seen estimates all the way from 7 minutes to 9 minutes to 12 minutes. I think 9 is the official. And to be on the ice with, and the only people on the ice, the players were all Hall of Famers. That's the only players who've been on the ice. And it was just you could have cut the emotion with a knife that night, you know. And what did we have about buildings? I still say, the three most famous buildings in Canada were the Montreal Forum, Maple Leaf Gardens, Toronto, and the Parliament buildings. Yeah. What is it about buildings that we had? And it was a very emotional the night that they closed the Gardens too, you know. It was.
My daughter's partner, he died very young. He was only 38 of a heart attack, and he was a lifelong Habs nut. And I remember going to the old Forum with my daughter with some of his ashes because, and of course it wasn't there anymore. That silly little section with a bunch of seats.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we sprinkled some some of his ashes on those seats. I said, "I'm sorry, honey, but this is where he wanted to be," you know.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it is, and Maple Leaf Gardens is a Loblaws now, and it just, I don't know why we don't respect those buildings a bit more.
You know, it was amazing that last year, the Forum closed in March, so they played the games, and they had the tickets all made up right to the end of the year. They didn't know. They weren't sure if they were going to be able to close it during the season or they'd have to finish the season there. And they went pretty late. March 12th was the night they closed it, and they only had about 3 more weeks to go in the season, and the playoffs started. But it was amazing that last season, how many people spoke to me who had come to Montreal from all over Canada because they wanted to see the Forum for the last time. People had never been there, ever. But they made the point to get down. I don't know how they got tickets. Right. All the games were sold out. Yeah. Scalpers must have had a great year that year. But what was the attraction, you know? And I'm sure the Gardens went through the same thing. And they had me go up to Toronto, hockey night, when each of the old 6 teams played their final game at Maple Leaf Gardens, because they did the same at the Gardens. They changed during the season. And the Canadiens played their last game just after Christmas. I forget what year that was. was. But anyway, they played, and they brought me up to be on the show that night, representing the Hockey Night in Canada crew in Montreal that had worked the games and so on. And they would have a leaf, an old timer leaf, and an old timer guy from the team that was there face the puck off every night. I think Bobby Hull did it for Chicago, and Bobby Orr did it for Boston, and Rocket Richard was there for Montreal. And he came out with Ted Kennedy, who was the captain of those great Leaf teams in the 50s, and when they won the cup. Rocket got the biggest cheer. Oh, it's amazing, you know. And that same day, Sil Apps had died. Sil Apps was a Maple Leaf hero. Ron McLean interviewed me about Sil Apps and about the fact that he had passed away that day. And I said, when I grew up, my dad was Sil Apps' coach when he first came in the NHL, and was his coach for the first 4 or 5 years he was in the league. And I said, every kid in Canada wanted to be Sil Apps. Every kid. But we never saw him. Eh? Picture in the newspaper, the odd hockey card. They weren't that big in those days. No television. Nobody knew what Sil Apps looked like, or you know how he skated or anything like that. There was quite a mystique about things in those days. You know. And
well, hockey is our story, isn't it? I mean, it's one of our primal stories in this country, and you know, wherever you're from. I was at theater school in Montreal, and I had a friend who was in business who used to come all the time, and he was great. He'd pick up the tab and he'd say, go into it every time. He'd take me to a Habs game. Yeah. We'd go to Tobe Lakes for a steak before, and we'd go there and we'd watch the game. I remember seeing Guy Lafleur. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. That hair, I just couldn't. I just was so cool. It was just and good seats too, right? Right down behind the bench, and so that's who we are. I think that's why people. Regina Pats. I remember making a movie out in Saskatchewan. I go and see the Regina Pats. I'd never seen anything like that before. People drive 6 hours.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's a hockey game to be at. Yeah. That's fantastic. So it's our story.
See, Lafleur, you mentioned Lafleur. That one image I have images of, you know, a lot of it melts together, of course, but the thing about him, and I wish the young players could have seen him. Every game he played, he never took a night off.
Yeah, never.
Didn't matter if they were playing the best team in the league, Boston, you know, or the worst team, the Colorado Rockies, whatever. He never took a night off. And I watched him every game he played almost for the Montreal Canadiens. It was incredible. Absolutely incredible. And it's something I remember Wayne Gretzky. I remember seeing Gretzky when he was injured. He missed the first half of the 92-93 season. He got hurt in the Canada Cup here in Montreal, actually. And so he didn't play. He was with the Kings in L.A., and the Canadiens played there in January, and he was just about ready to come back, but he still didn't play in the game. They were there just right at New Year's. And the practices were over in the morning of the game, and I was leaving the building, and I remember, it's one of the highlights of my hockey life, hearing somebody's on the ice. So I went out and I looked, and there was Gretzky. Now, he had been part of the Kings' practice, but all he had done was shoot the puck out from the corner. He hadn't participated in the practice really at all. He was all by himself. Around and around. Didn't have a puck. Had a stick, didn't have a puck. Chump, chump, chump. You could hear his skates going around, and I stood. Actually, I went and sat down in the front row, and there was nobody else in the building. There was nobody else in the building. It was quite a surreal moment for me. And he was getting ready to come back. Now, he could have quit then, you know, never played another game of hockey in his life, never missed a meal, you know what I mean? And he went and he sat down on the bench to give himself a rest, and he spotted me, and he kind of waved, and I just waved back. But I didn't want to go down and talk to him. He was in his world. Went back out again. Never forget that. And you could take young hockey players today and say, show it, take a look at that. You know, it's the same thing in broadcasting. I mean, it's the same thing in acting. It's the same thing in anything to do with quote unquote show business. The best ones are best for a reason.
That's right. You talk about young people today. If you were going to give some advice, you're probably wise enough not to, but if you were to a young broadcaster getting into the game you got into, I know it's a different game, what would that advice be?
Well, the best advice that I ever got was from a fellow named Dean Kay, who was a newscaster when CFCF came on the air. He'd been a veteran radio newscaster in Montreal. And, God, I ended up stone cold off the street standing there doing news with these guys. It was, you know. And he said to me one time, he said, always be yourself. And he pointed to a camera. We were standing in the studio waiting for the news to start one night. And he pointed to the camera that was in front of us. He said, if you're not yourself, that thing will pick it out so fast,
So true.
and people will see it so quickly that you won't make it. And
Cameras have got built-in BS detectors.
that's right.
Yeah.
And so, and that's one thing that's, sure, you do your homework and you gotta, try to know what you're talking about. A little bit of it. Sometimes you don't, but I always say, when in doubt, keep talking. I'd have to sit down with broadcasters. I've sat down. There's been a few fellows that have come through in Montreal here to do radio, and they've asked to sit. I've had lunch with them and talked to them about how I did things and so on. Whether it helped them or not, I don't know. We're talking here in 2013. I did my last Hockey Night in Canada broadcast in 1999. Since then, there has not been one Montreal-based broadcaster appear in this city on Hockey Night in Canada. Every broadcaster that's done any game that the Montreal Canadiens have played here in Montreal at the Bell Centre has been brought in from, they had to pay an airfare to bring the guy in. Nobody. And I don't understand that. I do not understand that there hasn't been somebody, to come along. Danny lived in Montreal. He moved, and he was a Montrealer for the last 40 years of his life. And, it's funny. Appreciate it.
You mentioned some great hockey moments, but you covered other sports, Olympic sports. What outside of hockey, was there a great thing you saw, a great performance?
The Innsbruck Olympics of 1976. The first Olympic Games since the Munich massacre. But they were so simple. They were so well run, and of course there was a lot of, I'm sure they spend more on security at the Olympics now in one day than they spent the whole Olympics in Innsbruck. It was such a beautiful, beautiful place. I didn't have a day off in 19 days. I remember CTV, worked my socks off. I did sports. I did luge. I never even heard of the luge. And biathlon, and they said I didn't do hockey. Canada didn't have a team in hockey that year. They had some kind of a dispute going with the Olympic Association. They didn't put a team in the game. That whole time that I spent there was just such a highlight for me. It was just everything. I had never done the Olympics before. Montreal games, CBC had the right. We had CTV had them for Innsbruck. CBC had them for Montreal. But we did a show every night for 2 hours, a recap show, and I was the host. But you weren't on the sites necessarily. But the Olympics were good, and then I was in Lake Placid for the games there, only partially. I didn't do the whole games, but I did the opening ceremonies with Lloyd Robertson, a real pro. I've done 2 shows. I did that with Lloyd Robertson. I did Maurice Richard's funeral with Peter Mansbridge. And like I said, people get to the top for a reason.
Yeah.
And they were both
pros.
Yeah, very much so. So, it's hard to think back. I did a lot of golf. I did golf for CTV for 20 years.
Are you a golfer?
Yeah.
No.
And enjoyed that very much. In fact, I missed that when I retired. I didn't care if I ever did another hockey game. Didn't bother me. But I missed doing the golf. I really did. And so, I broadcast Nicholas and Trevino and Palmer, and they all showed up at the Canadian Open.
To me, that is a great art, golf announcing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's totally
you can't
different.
intrude on the game too much. And it's when you hear somebody that does it right, it's really a pleasure.
Yeah. No, I had good times doing golf. That was one of the highlights for me.
Well, one last question. If you could wish something for hockey, the state of hockey, what would it be?
Well, I have a 10-year-old grandson who's a hockey player. And just yesterday I watched him play a playoff game, winner take all, and it ended up his team won in a shootout. 10-year-old kids in a shootout. And I sat there. It was in the same arena where I did a series of 4 years of a show called Montreal Minor Hockey. And there was Bantam hockey players in the 60s, and we did that on CFCF. Another reason that CFCF was popular, and we did things like that. And here I was back at the same arena, and a lot of memories. I coached in that same arena for 10 years. I thought, I hope none of these kids I hope they never lose their enthusiasm for the game. There's one kid out there who's never going to play in the NHL probably, but just don't lose. And I just hope that Canadians don't lose their enthusiasm for the game. I don't think they will. I think the lockout proves that. Everybody's mad at them for the lockout, but they go back. right? In a minute, bingo, they're back buying tickets, and it's like nothing ever happened, you know. And I mean, I was 1 month old when my father won his first Stanley Cup, and he coached the Toronto Maple Leafs. It was the first cup that the Toronto team won as the Maple Leafs, 1932, first year of the Maple Leaf Gardens. And so it's been part of my life for 81 years. And I've loved every minute of it, you know. I just hope that they can, you can talk about the game, you can talk about the rough stuff. I don't care if I ever see another hockey fight. I said that when I was broadcasting the games, never mind now, you know. But it's got to be a great game for those people, for those of us in Canada who still think about it the way we do. I can show you a headline in a newspaper in 1914 in Winnipeg. And my dad was a center of some controversy, and they weren't going to allow him to play in a playoff game. It's a long, involved story. He played in another league, and therefore he was ruled ineligible. That story was the front page headline of the Winnipeg Tribune. Now, that's in 1914. Hockey in those days was the front page story in this country. That's how long ago, that's how long it goes back. And I hope it never stops. Yeah.
Me too. One last thing. It's actress 70th birthday this year.
70?
70.
You're just a kid.
Yeah.
Compared to
So
me.
could you say happy birthday, actor?
Sure. To you or to the camera?
Thank you.
Yeah. Welcome to the club. Happy birthday, number 70, actor.
Thanks. Thank you so
Can I
much.
ask just one more question?
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I don't know if you're allowed to say this, but I just want to tell you a little story. I was going to school in Paris, France, and I would always try to watch the hockey games because I have 3 older brothers and a father who is an avid hockey fan.
So you had no choice. You had to grow up with hockey.
My mother and I were just stuck in front of watching Hockey Night in Canada on a Saturday night for sure. And one night I managed to get the game. It was the Habs and the Bruins, I believe. And for whatever reason, they hadn't flipped the switch. So what did I hear from the kitchen while I was making dinner was live from the Montreal Forum, it's Hockey Night in Canada. And it was your voice.
Come on, you're not that old.
Well, I am. But I remember you saying it every night. Every night when the play from the Montreal Forum, it was your voice. And I don't know if you're allowed to say it, but I would love to hear it again. I'd love to hear that slogan that is so Dick Irvin, that's so the voice of the Forum before the game started. That's what started the game for me, was your voice saying just those words.
Saying, what? You have to pay me for this. Live from the Forum in Montreal, Hockey Night in Canada.
Yeah. Thank you.
That was just lovely. Thank you so much. Thank